Alright, it is recording now.
So then you will probably that, and then you just focus on transitioning your own slides.
On here.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then he'll help you out.
Hi everyone. Today we're going to be presenting about Mexico's transition to democracy. My name is Erin, and I'm going to begin talking about the authoritarian rule in Mexico, mostly characterized by people like Lázaro Cárdenas, who was the president and who was able to consolidate pre-power through different societal and economic reforms.
Hello everyone, my name is Austin and I will be talking about Mexico's transition to democracy, and one of the influential figures during this time was Carlos Salinas, and under him he promoted economic liberalization and electoral reforms that eventually led to the transition to democracy.
My name is Keely and I will be talking about post-transition democracy in Mexico, specifically consolidated by the election in 2000 of President Vicente Fox.
And I'm Marianis, and I'll be talking about the prospects and challenges of Mexican democracy, especially with the newly inaugurated President López Obrador.
And we will take any questions at the end.
So to begin, we're going to introduce the region and kind of the time period a little bit, because Mexico is a unique case. More specifically, Mexico actually became a separate country in 1821 when it got its independence. But we're going to be focusing specifically on the period between 1929 and 2018, because 1929 was when the PRI, or the Institutional Revolutionary Party, here's its emblem, was first instituted in power, and the period of authoritarianism we're going to be talking about. So to begin, like I said before, I'm going to be talking about the authoritarian rule. Specifically this slide, I'm going to be talking about the rise of the PRI power and how they were able to consolidate their regime and how everything was able to work out. So to begin, the PRI was started by a man named Plutarco Elias Calles, who, after the assassination of a military general who had made himself president in the years after the Mexican Revolution, Calles was able to claim power because of this transition, and he started the PRI with the intents of giving different spoils and giving different power to the revolutionary generals that had actually helped fight in the revolution. And another one of his big main concerns was continuing the Mexican Revolution into society and finding a way to integrate it. Some of the main ideals of the Mexican Revolution was that workers would have more rights, the land would be distributed, there would be more freedom of speech and press. For example, in this picture when it says Tierra y Libertad, that means land and freedom. So all the people in here and everybody participating in the revolution wanted that for themselves and wanted to have more benefits and reforms. So that's how the Mexican Revolution, I guess, kind of ties into this. But the Mexican Constitution of 1917 was the actual start of the authoritarian consolidation, and that was because, well, it may seem a little contradictory because a constitution sets up checks and balances, and it sets up kind of a way of working, and that doesn't usually exist within it didn't exist within a usual dictatorship. But in this case, it actually made it easier for the executive to pass reforms because the Calles and the other presidents were the head of the party as well as the president. And since the PRI had a 2/3 majority in the legislature, they were able to pass these amendments and reforms, such as making sure the president had extra security and making sure that he could expand his time limits, or his term limits. And so because of that, I'm going to move on to applying Barbara Geddes' idea of a single-party regime, and that more specifically means that the party has some kind of control over the individuals for a long period of time, which is very representative in Mexico because there were multiple presidents, and they did follow the rules of the Constitution in having different leaders in power, but they were still under the same premise of the PRI party and its ideals from the very beginning. So, for example, the party did change over time as different individuals took place. For example, in 1929, the PNR was under Calles, the PRM was under Cardenas, who I'm going to talk about, and the PRI was, or the PRI was eventually consolidated under Miguel Alemán, who I'll talk about in the next slide. But overall, it was the same party with the same ideals, with alternating leaders. And another thing Barbara Geddes talks about within a single party regime that makes it unique is that there is co-optation rather than exclusion in order to try and get support from society. So within the Mexican regime, or the pre-regime at this time, for example, in this picture, there are a bunch of you can see that there's people from the agriculture sector, from the worker sector and labor and everything like that. And Cardenas is here signing all these different reforms. And his goal was to be able to apply to all different levels of society so that he could gain their support. So he gave more socialist education, more workers' rights. He gave the more common person more land. And that was how he was able to maintain his power and his legitimacy, because basically nobody was opposed to his position. And another thing that Geddes talks about in her article is that single-party regimes and the party are able to control the career paths of officials. And that's very relevant in the society because there were patron-client relationships where the advancement of someone in politics was related to how well they tied to the pre-regime and to the executive themselves, and how well they allied with their goals and different responsibilities. So moving on to what Bueno de Mosquito would think about the Mexican, the pre-regime, I set up this little graphic first to explain that the nominal selectorate, or the people that are legally able to choose who's going to be in power, in this case were the people eligible to vote for the PRI, or the people that were going to benefit from all the different reforms. And in the real selectorate case, which is number 2, which are the people that actually decide who is going to be in power, were the PRI party members. And then to end it, the winning coalition, the people that actually decide who's going to stay in power, the people that are essential to the executive remaining, are the camarillas, or also known as the party leaders and elites. So in this case, in Bueno de Mosquito's analysis, both the nominal selectorate and the real selectorate, or the eligible to vote for PRI and the PRI party members, should be as large as possible in order to maintain that popular support and that legitimacy over time that let them stay in power for 7 years. And that's why they did co-opt these different levels of society. But I would like to mention that the camarillas still had a huge role in determining who became president, because they were actually the ones that collectively decided who was going to be the next president. For example, in the case of Miguel Alemán in 1946, he was the first president that didn't have a military background. He came to power and became president through his own camarilla network, because they were able to pick him. He allied with the pre-regime and their ideals the most, and was able to keep up that power for more than 70 years.
Thank you, Erin. Now my portion of the presentation will discuss the actual transition to democracy. To begin, I will discuss the key dates and figures in Mexico's transitions, and then I will use 3 different arguments from our readings and from other sources to explain why the PRI lost its power and democratization in Mexico was able to occur. The PRI single-party authoritarian regime began to decline in 1982 with the election of Miguel de la Madrid, as can be seen here by the timeline. However, I think it's important to discuss the student protests that occurred in 1968 first, which is before this period of transition. So the period of transition lasts about 20 years, and then this predate, which I think is important to note. These protests first that were later termed the Tlatelolco massacre, and it's the first instance where the Pre's party was actually challenged. So in short, these students were protesting the police's use of violence against them. And then once the government realized that these protests were getting out of hand, they sent in the army to actually stop the protests, and it ended up killing a bunch of students. Estimates between 4 students and 3,000 is what the data shows. There was no official report considering that the PRI was in power and they wanted to cover this up as quickly as possible. However, this incident is really important because it displayed the lengths that the PRI would go to maintain their power over the government, and also the power of the PRI at the time, because they were able to quash this desire for democracy in Mexico at the time. Their power, like I said before, began to decline in 1982, but then also in 1982 with the election of De La Madrid, because he began a series of economic liberalization and electoral reforms that would be instrumental to the decline of the PRI in the future. During this year, he actually signed onto the General Trade and Tariffs Agreement, also known as GATT, and he also juiced electoral integrity in local elections. These reforms led to other parties, such as the National Action Party or the PAN, to win local elections, which had never been seen before in Mexican politics. Then in 1988, with the election of Carlos Salinas, the true strength of the opposition parties came to the forefront, because the PAN ended up winning 240 out of the 500 seats in the Mexican legislature, ensuring that the PRI must compromise in some way to pass any kind of legislation for the next term. The PRI was then forced to continue, like I said, this path towards electoral reform, which ended up fracturing the party itself. This fracture led to the creation of the Party of the Democratic Revolution, or the PRD, which was actually formed by 2 former PRI elites, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas y Porfirio Muñoz Ledo. And then in 1989, the first opposition-held state governor was elected in Baja California Norte, and these electoral showings became the first period where people felt that their vote had actually mattered and they were being represented in the government. In the past, the PRI had frauded and skewed elections to ensure that they kept their power. However, with these electoral reforms, the opposition parties in Mexico were given a chance to oppose the PRI for the first time in Mexican history. Additionally, alongside these electoral reforms, the PRI, or NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was signed in 1983 alongside the Asian Pacific Economic Coalition, I believe, or APEC, Economic Cooperation. They were both signed in 1993. And so this further showed that Salinas was committed to a globally connected Mexico, at least economically. And these trade agreements liberalized trade policy, attracting more investment into Mexico. And then finally, in 1944, with the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, it displayed a growing unrest with the PRI. This small indigenous group led an uprising that eventually led to the assassination of the PRI party presidential candidate at the time. And then with months before the election, the PRI were forced to choose a new candidate, which ended up being Ernesto Zedillo, who was then elected president in 1994, which further cemented to fragmentation within the party. Wasn't everyone's first choice, and it led to all of those problems there. He continued the electoral reforms by allowing the Federal Electoral Institute to become independent of government control. And then finally, in 1997, another clear shift happened. The PRI lost its absolute majority in the Chamber of Deputies, which can be interpreted as a tipping point of the PRI losing its power. This moment is significant, obviously, due to its symbolic defeat. They were no longer able to pass rubber stamp legislation through the legislature, and they were forced to compromise in some areas that they normally had not been. and also it showed that there was non-popularity with the PRI at the time. The other importance is that the PRI lost its hold over the opposition parties, like Aaron was talking about. They co-opted the opposition to bring them into their ranks, and as it was significant from this loss, they no longer were as good at it as they once were. And thus it became no surprise when Vicente Fox, leader of the PAN, won the election in 2000, cementing the completion of the transition to democracy. The first of the three, like I said before, the first of the three arguments that I want to explore are Lipset-Wyszynski's and Limonier's modernization, or theory of modernization. In essence, they argue that economic development within a country leads to a country to democratize. As income and investment grows, the authoritarian country will begin to adopt democratic reforms in an effort to appease its people. This is an example of what happened in Mexico when Mexico sought these trade agreements through NAFTA, the APEC, the EU, the GATT. The party members of the PRI and Mexico citizens began to liberalize and develop economically. Thus, it was no wonder that the PRI was forced to pursue electoral reforms and would later lead to the transition to democracy. Second, Bueno de Mesquita and Smith argue that there are three types of groups, once again, as Aaron said, in each system that the leader in power must appeal to in order to maintain their power. For Mexico, the winning coalition, or the real selectorate, were the PRI party members. Following the election of 1988 of Carlos Salinas, the PRD, like I said before, was created by two former PRI members, and this clear elite division is the best example of Bueno de Mesquita and Smith's argument that the winning coalition is necessary to maintain the power over the system. Since the PRI lost its cohesive nature, opposition parties began to grow and take the place of the PRI in local elections and also at the national level. And this elite division may not have led to the PRI's downfall initially, but it severely weakened its ability to control the political landscape in Mexico. Finally, I want to make a brief comparison of the 1968 student protests and the Zapatista uprising to show the growth of civil society in Mexico. A strong civil society leads to a stronger democracy, so this instance is simply part of the larger picture of Mexico's transition to democracy. In 1968, the PRI maintained their power through violence and bloodshed. While the result was gruesome and horrible, the PRI were able to get away with the massacre without any real political damage. However, the Zapatista uprising, if nothing else, resulted in the death of the PRI presidential candidate, indicating a shift from the people's desire for democracy and the reaction of the government. Once again, the Zapatista uprising didn't shift power immediately, but it further pushed the PRI's dominance into question, eventually leading to their downfall in the 2000 election. In conclusion, the PRI's power was chipped away by economic, internal, and social struggles that occurred during these final 20 years. I believe that each of these moments in their history contribute to the eventual alternation of power in the 2000 election. The end.
Actually, you know what? I think it might be better if I. Okay, yeah. Thank you, though. Thank you, Austin. So again, I will be talking about post-transitional democracy in Mexico. So first, I'll be talking about the consolidation of democracy with the election of Vicente Fox and the PAN party, which was further consolidated with the election of Felipe Calderón. Then I will be talking about the further and following party alternations with the election of the PRI again in 2012 with Enrique Peña Nieto, and finally with a third party, Morena, under President AMLO. So first, in 2000, Mexico solidified its democracy with the election of President Vicente Fox. Fox was a member of the PAN party, but not that kind of PAN.
No, this one.
Oh. Not that kind of PAN. And became the first Mexican president to be elected outside the PRI. Since Fox's election, there's been a party alternation between the political parties on a national level, a key feature of democracy, according to Anna Przybylowski. After the PRI's electoral defeat, its compliance in becoming an opposition party supported a smooth transition to democracy. Defiance of the election would have continued the authoritarian trend. In 2006, Felipe Calderón was elected, and the PAN party was elected again. further solidifying that the election in 2000 was just not a lapse in the PRI regime. However, power shifted back to the PRI in 2012 with the election of Enrique Peña Nieto. The 2018 election was anticipated to be a crucial moment because it would either consolidate Mexico's democracy or lead Mexico back into single-party rule. A second PRI victory in the 2018 election would probably suggest the latter. There is speculation that Peña Nieto and the pre-regime may have been reelected due to authoritarian nostalgia or the idea that citizens prefer authoritarianism to democracy because of perceived sense of stability within the prior system. This is because before the transition to democracy in 2000, under the 70-year pre-regime, there was a lot of corruption and there was not a lot of regulation of crime and drug trafficking. And because there was no policing of the government, there wasn't a ton of violence as a result. When Calderón was elected with the PAN in 2006, he was famous for a huge crackdown on drug trafficking specifically, which resulted in an uprise in violence and the deaths of hundreds of Mexicans. So because of the instability created by Calderón's term, there's speculation that the common Mexican citizen who was largely subject to this violence would prefer the authoritarian stability of the pre-regime. Surprisingly, in 2018, neither the PAN, the PRI, nor the PRD, which is the third major party in Mexico, won the election. Andrés Manuel López Obrador, also known as AMLO, a member of the National Regeneration Movement, Morena Party, won the election by 53% of the popular vote. And as Mexico has elected a president outside the three major parties of the late 20th century, it's unlikely that democracy will backslide into a single-party authoritarian regime again. Because of this party alternation and how we've stated that Mexican democracy was solidified in 2000, it's important to define what type of democracy it is. So in our readings, we've discussed a thin versus thick definition of democracy, thin definition being described by Joseph Schumpeter, who basically defines democracy as the mere presence of elections. There's not really much more to it than that. Whereas Larry Diamond and Samuel Huntington kind of give a more robust definition of democracy, which includes political rights, equal rule of law, independent judiciaries, civil rights and liberties, and more. So before, during the PRI regime, because of the intense corruption and neglect of civil liberties, it could be defined as a democracy under Schumpeter's thin definition. However, Mexico would not be considered a more robust democratic system until 2000 under the definition of Diamond and Huntington because of the advances made in political equality, equal rule of law, and economic equality as well. Now, democracy has also benefited greater Mexican society, specifically within education, public health, and the reduction of economic inequality within the country. So for education, as you can see here, though it was steadily inclining before the transition in 2000, the average years of education for Mexicans went from 6.5 all the way to 8.5 in 2016, so there was a significant increase during this democratic consolidation. In tandem with that, literacy over the age of 15 has increased 4.5% since 2000. And in terms of public health, under 5 mortality rates and also maternal mortality rates have steadily decreased since 2000, also since 1990, but this also shows that while Mexico was transitioning to democracy, the benefits of democracy were already being put in place. I think most importantly is that there has been a significant reduction of inequality, economic inequality, since the transition to democracy, which has decreased via the Gini coefficient from 51.4 in 2000 to 43.6 in 2016, according to the World Bank. This is important because, according to Adam Prusworski, again, a growing middle class is essential for a sustainable democracy, which indicates that there is a lesser likelihood of democratic erosion. So this is something that makes democracies endure, but it can also be used to argue Austin's point in the beginning, where because of economic liberalization and economic development, democracy became stronger, and it also guarantees the continuation of democracy. So to recap, for post-transition democracy, I'd like you to take away that after the election of Vicente Fox and the PAN, there was a lot of party alternation all the way to 2018, which suggests that there is a very low chance of democratic backslide. The PRI was elected again in 2012, possibly due to authoritarian nostalgia. And this causes us to categorize Mexico under either a thin or thick definition of democracy, and overall that Mexico has benefited under democratic rule.
So for prospects of Mexican democracy, so when we look at the 2001 Freedom House score, 1 year after Vicente Fox was elected democratically, the Freedom House score was free, and Mexico seemed to be going on a very positive path. However, by 2017, Mexico, by Freedom House, has been categorized as partly free, particularly because of a weak judicial institution, also a lack of protection against corruption, and again, very weak due process. Under Peña Nieto's presidency, it was promised to reduce violence and corruption. However, that has been the complete opposite as of 2018, since with the end of his term in 2018. In fact, 2017 was the most violent year, even more than Felipe Calderon, and corruption has been, and high-level officials, especially from the PRI party, have already been convicted of high-level corruption. As a result, many people do not see Peña Nieto very positively, and in fact, that causes the PRI to also look negative, as the PRI was somewhat seen as another opportunity, but that in fact failed. Because it did fail, this led to the inauguration and the election of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or colloquially known as AMLO. AMLO will be the first leftist president representing the Morena party. However, he has been in the public eye in Mexican politics since Vicente Fox's inauguration of being the former Mexico City mayor, and he has been twice former presidential candidates. All the way on the right, you can see, as Keely mentioned, AMLO did win 53% of the vote of first time for Mexico, as it has always been very fragmented, and you can see that virtually every single state, except Guanajuato in the clear blue, voted for President AMLO. People of all ages, all economic statuses, and education voted for AMLO because they are attempting to protest against traditional parties and really want Mexico to pivot completely from the progress it has done. However, this again shows that Mexico is a democracy with multiple parties now being elected. However, there are major challenges that AMLO will have to face in his 6-year term that will end in 2024. One of the national challenges that can be seen that is particularly different in Peña Nieto's term is the rise of lack of freedom of press, where journalists have now become deliberately assassinated or intimidated as they have somewhat begun investigating into corruption cases. This is obviously much more dangerous when those areas are in drug trafficking states or municipalities. However, this has been a common thing that many Mexicans are now worried about, as obviously freedom of press is a big democratic value. In addition, before the July 2018 election, where AMLO was elected, multiple candidates opposite of corruption or perhaps maybe traditional parties were deliberately assassinated. Again, this is even higher in states with drug trafficking activity. Furthermore, there are state-level challenges that makes it very unique to Mexico. Well, not necessarily unique to Mexico, but contrasts Mexico's national level, democratic level. So one thing that this graph determines is that Mexican citizens, especially in poorer states, are subject to vote buying or vote coercion. So because there still is a lot of social inequality, Mexicans sometimes are susceptible for perhaps traditional parties granting money or services in exchange for their vote, and then will place their vote for a specific party for perhaps their judges or even for a presidential election. As a result, this completely contradicts a democracy where free, fair elections are supposed to take place, and in turn, this only causes some states to only have experienced one continuous party still to this day, somewhat in a similar way to the authoritarian regime of the PRI, but on a national level. Furthermore, on the very right, you can see a political cartoon of how this may have affected Peña Nieto's ability to rise to become a presidential candidate and eventually president. And on the further right, below, you can see how Mexico is perceived as one of the most corrupt countries, especially in 2017. Again, because under Peña Nieto's term, this has only increased, not decreased. And again, this goes back to why President AMLO, a leftist president, was elected. And with that, we would like to ask if you guys have questions.
So we're 6 minutes over.